So now that all of the Pantheon encounters are out, and we have, at the time of this recording, only 2 days left until the game mode is going away when Final Shape launches, I thought it would be a neat idea to dissect everything we've been given in the minus 20 version. This video is going to be going over the minus 20 version of Pantheon encounters, and my overall thoughts on the changes. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that regardless of my opinion on any of these encounters, I'm overall really happy with what Bungie did with Pantheon. I think it adds a lot of replayability for people who want to practice in higher end content, and the rewards encourage raiders of above the minimum skill level to try out. And remember, at the end of the day, it's my opinion, and it's not the Pantheon Raid Bible. Let's begin. The first boss I will be going over is Golgoroth. When I saw that this encounter was in the rotation, I wasn't entirely excited because I didn't know what to expect, and to be honest, I think Golgoroth is perfectly fine as is. There's not really much to adjust, as I think it plays out perfectly fine, and the changes when you compare the original encounter from Destiny 1 to Destiny 2 were already good enough to where you can't really add more than what's already there. At first glance, I thought adding in more ads to kill at the beginning was pretty lazy. However, after playing through minus 20, I thought it was a good change of pace. The boss knights aren't outright hard to kill, but you have to be very careful with how you approach them, and the additional taken ogres that spawn later in the fight are also tolerable, but still threatening if you don't take care of them quickly enough. The extra minotaurs that spawn during damage for the gaze holders, however, are such a more noticeable addition that I personally really appreciate, because you have more to worry about during your time holding the gaze. In addition to calling out your timer, now you have to worry about avoiding or killing these invisible taken minotaurs that try to delete you on minus 20, and you also have to juggle the darts Golgoroth shoots at you, which really hurt on minus 20. You're probably dying on like 1 or 2 hits if you're lucky. This change is great, since before you would pretty much be staring at your timer, and the job was pretty much laid back, and now, with the Pantheon changes, you have to be more active, and you're more likely to be put in a bad situation if you're not on top of your positioning. I think the real highlight, though, was the second unstable light. It's interesting, because it's a risk-reward situation. On one hand, it causes more chaos down in the pools during damage, since if it's not coordinated properly, it can cause a lot of issues and a damage loss. But at the same time, if you get both bombs off on Golgoroth, it does more damage than it would with just one bomb on the normal version. I personally was really surprised with what Bungie did here, and it showed that Pantheon was pretty promising on what it was going to showcase in every encounter. And I personally think that the changes they did in this encounter are very, very good, considering that this encounter can't really get much better as it already was in the normal version. With Caretaker, my feelings towards this encounter aren't generally positive since there's not a lot of changes here and I feel like they're pretty minor. The extra ads on Stunning, while yes, I do think it's a good change, I'm still not a fan of it. It's not that it's particularly hard to deal with, I just think here it feels like a copy-paste change and they couldn't come up with something else. I know I was just praising Golgoroth that did this exact change, but to me it generally feels like they could have done more here. The runners dealing with an additional wizard and the extra pyramid projectile that spawns occasionally is good to keep up the pressure, but 90% of the time the pyramid projectile will just hit a wall and be out of the equation, and the wizards are pretty easy to ignore, so you really don't feel this. While I was initially worried that we would be back to 3-flooring on minus 20, the damage check is a complete joke if people know how to coordinate their burst damage. It is genuinely really hard to screw up the damage check, since you have burns and a global damage buff everyone can take advantage of. The only saving grace is that on minus 20, it's an encounter that is fast-paced and absolutely everything hurts, and I do think that's what holds everything together here. The high difficulty and threat everything brings in the encounter, the wizards while running, the extra ads for ad clear, and Caretaker himself for stunners. Everything is a threat, and I think for that reason, I can't completely say the changes are bad. There's another encounter later on in the Pantheon playlist that mimics changes that are pretty similar here, but it's done much, much better, and it's simply just because of how much urgency there is to get things done in that encounter compared to here. Caretaker's a solid encounter, even before the Pantheon changes, though, so while I'm not crazy about the copy-paste changes that were done here, it's still Caretaker, and it's still a fun encounter, and I highly recommend playing it. For Explicator, this is another case like Golgoroth where I think this encounter is perfectly fine as is, but unlike Golgoroth, this encounter added things that aren't necessarily enhancing mechanics, but man, they are definitely noticeable. The fire tornadoes the boss spawns periodically are great. It means you have to be on lookout constantly on the side plates. What's actually neat about this is that you can actually tell when the boss is about to spawn them in. Just like during damage when the boss does his animation where he pulls out a pad, the tornadoes will be summoned on one of the plates. This is also the first encounter where we are introduced to a Tormentor spawn. When you finish your first set of planets, the Tormentor will spawn in the middle by the boss. While I'm not crazy about it, I think it works fine here because you have a breathing period before you start doing your middle dunks, so you're able to focus on that spawn and prioritize killing it if your team wanted to. My team typically either melted it with a Strand Titan as soon as it spawned, or we spammed blinding grenades or tractor cannon and carried on with our day. As someone who did run on day 1, I can assure you that the damage check is not really one you can sleep on. This damage check, unlike Caretaker, is actually one of the hardest damage checks in the game, even with the matching burns and the global damage buff modifier. During damage, the tornadoes the boss spawns are absolutely painful. If you even catch the edge of it, you're very likely dead, and while yes, you can offset this by well, you still have to be smart with the placement on -20. So with that in mind, and having to make sure you're not getting in front of people's rockets or GLs, and also trying not to get deleted by a tornado, since you'd suffer a damage loss if you dialed most likely, I really appreciate this damage check more. This encounter really does test how well you think you can hold up with your burst rotations. The changes showcase how additional hazards to worry about can actually really mess with you, and people tend to overlook them because of how strong we are currently. While the pacing of this encounter is unchanged in the grand scheme of things, if you've cleared this on any of the previous weeks, it's probably nothing too different. I already enjoyed this encounter as is, and -20 Pantheon Explicator is definitely up there on my favorite Pantheon encounter personally. When it comes to Aatrax, I unfortunately think this is the weakest of all 8 encounters. My main issue is the scoring, as you almost always have to kill the Tormentor. While I understand it's more of a general Pantheon thing and not tied to the encounter, it's still pretty annoying and scoring is unclear. Also, the changes aren't really noticeable because you can still 1-4 her even on -20. Your game plan is still exactly the same. Nothing changes besides a Tormentor spawn. To me, this is also lazy. I give Caretaker a lot of shit because practically nothing changed unless you're a stunner and you were still able to 2-4. But at least on Caretaker, I actually had a decent time and it's not a complete cakewalk. Plus, I don't have to constantly be screwed over if I didn't kill a specific ad for the high score triumph. This is a problem in every week besides week 1, which is what really bothers me. A lot of people I know are locked out of Godslayer just because they are missing high score in this encounter on many different difficulties. I know some people will say skill issue, but this is honestly more of an inconvenience than it is skill issue. I think if the high score triumph in this encounter was fixed, it would probably still be this low because just like Caretaker, there's only minor changes and it wasn't significant enough for this encounter's game plan to outright change. You still send 6 people up to the top floor, you still get to final stand within 2 TPs on average, and you still get the same chaotic encounter as you did even without -20. The only difference is everything hurts really bad and starting down below is much more of a hassle since you have the addition of the Tormentor spawn. I would have loved to see something that required more urgency, like locking out Scanner every time you damage the clone and forcing you to use the terminal swap buffs during the damage phase. This would create a situation where you could not send all 6 players on the top floor and do damage the traditional way of 3 on each floor instead. Is it an encounter that is absolutely hindered by the change? No, absolutely not. Everything hurts and you still have to play very carefully while being on a short timer. It's still a really good fight to play on -20 though, but when compared to the other encounters, this one falls short by a decent margin. Oryx is an oddball to me. Some of the changes they implemented are really good, like the double shades and the respawning Light Eater Knights, but some others, specifically the Tormentor spawn during damage, I'm not exactly sure on. This encounter on -20 is definitely on the lighter side of difficulty to me, because it's relatively quick and you're progressing relatively quickly in the encounter anyway. It's unfortunate that you don't always get the double shades, as that's by far the highlight of the encounter and it is a lot of fun. I think part of that being RNG is a little bit annoying. The bombs change is honestly not noticeable for a lot of teams, since you should be killing all 4 knights anyway to stop the bombs from spawning, even on normal. But I can understand how chaotic this is for some teams, since on -20, this is not exactly something you can do quickly. Lots of deaths will probably happen unless you have a game plan for when you get the bombs. For the Tormentor, if you don't kill a Tormentor quickly during final stand, it's definitely a problem, but that's also a coin flip because it can spawn in the back of the room by the rally flag, and you can completely ignore it on some runs. Besides that, I feel like the addition is a little silly, considering when it spawns, you already have the Brand of Immortality and you're practically unkillable inside of it. It's a weird one. There's some situations where it is genuinely threatening, like the final stand situation I just explained earlier, or if you don't instantly kill it after damage and get bombs. That situation in particular is pretty shit to be in, because it can get really chaotic. Other times, when you get shades, it's a longer window that you have before Oryx does the animation to start the shades, so it poses 0 threat and it should be dead by the time the shades phase actually starts. I do think the respawning Light Eater Knights are pretty solid, and just like in other encounters like Nezarec and Riven, getting more people active in an otherwise mind-numbing encounter is always something I will advocate for. Overall, Oryx is a really solid addition to the Pantheon roster, and the changes, while somewhat questionable at times, are still requiring your attention and not things you can outright ignore, which I think is acceptable. Without a doubt, Rolk is the best encounter in Pantheon, and I think many people will agree. Every change shown in this encounter really highlights the potential Pantheon has and how much the devs have really put some thought into it. The Tormentor is actually a great addition here. The runners actively get disrupted from the Tormentor spawn, because if you get unlucky with it spawning at the back totems as you make your way there as a runner, you will probably die getting one-shotted by it, and because the arena is really small and narrow, it's very hard to dodge it. If you aren't focusing on killing the Tormentor as soon as it spawns, or someone doesn't have blinding grenades, you are going to get absolutely railed by it, or get pushed off the map. And on top of that, you lose precious time for that high score. Remember how earlier during the Caretaker segment I was talking about another encounter that does ads much better? This is the encounter I was referring to. There's another encounter that I'd like to highlight that I think this idea generally stems from before Pantheon Roll. The third encounter from DSC. While it's a complete joke nowadays at 1600 light, it's an encounter that did something right that I honestly think that we would never see again. Specifically, the overload captain that you see that spawns during the bomb segment is really, really interesting because while it's not directly something that you have to kill to progress the encounter, it still poses a threat that if you don't take care of it, it's going to affect your progress doing the objective. This one overload captain creates pressure for the bomb carriers that can very easily kill the flow of an encounter if they're not taken care of. The Tormentor here fulfills the exact same job, and it actually makes sense why it spawns. That's why I like it here. I really think this is a great way of introducing threatening ads that don't feel like a copy paste, and actively create a sense of urgency to focus your attention onto it. While, yes, it's a champion, and generally speaking, people are kind of sick and tired of champions, I still think this was done much, much, much better than in other encounters. The addition of the Taken Wizards I don't notice as much, but I will probably feel it after I inevitably play the raid on the non-Pantheon mode. The best part, by far, is when you walk up the stairs and all of a sudden you just see Rolk shitting out another copy of himself. This copy does everything he does, just without the bullshit desync lasers, and he's not doing the constant dashes. I shit you not, this encounter is already stressful as it is on -20 when you're up here, but now you have another batshit crazy Rolk on the loose. So now you have to step up your reaction time, and make sure you survive and dodge both attacks. You still have to be on time with dunking your symbols too. Everything leading up to the damage phase can be really stressful, especially if you don't have a dedicated person trying to kite the copy. Once damage starts, you have to play very well from this moment on. It is by far the hardest damage check. It's not because of the damage requirements itself, it's more because you have to constantly move and multitask. You have threats like Rolk and the copy, in addition to his laser attacks and the constant dashes. It's all a big test to see how much you can handle. You are forced to two-phase for the high score as well. Even with burns and shot collar procced on -20, this is honestly rough unless you have 0 deaths, and that's very much easier said than done. It is such a well-crafted fight with these changes that it made me realize how good we had it back then when we had hard modes of raids. It's such a clear winner, and I really think Bungie absolutely nailed it with these changes. Probably a hot take, but I think the additions to Riven fell flat. I understand that doing this encounter the legitimate way is really exciting to a lot of players, especially those who've never actually done it, but I really anticipated more, especially after the previous week of Rolk, and imagining the potential horrors they could have added for this encounter. I was just absolutely excited at the time, as well as others. I was really surprised that Bungie was very laid back in terms of changes for this encounter. Only 2 Minotaurs and some Phalanxes to shoot at when you start the encounter is pretty lazy in my books. And while, yes, the damage resistance that Riven gets on each floor is really welcoming and encourages you to do the entire encounter, it's still way too quick because the blisters do way too much damage, and it's not really the way that it was done back in the day. Part of the charm of legit Riven was that it took multiple cycles back in the day to complete, and now the one phase just feels something left to be desired. I just really wish there was something that was introduced here that would really affect us more than just extra ads on the lower floors. It's kind of a shame because it just feels like Oryx where things are just going by way too quickly, and you can just immediately skip shooting the eyes and not even deal damage on the lower floors also. You could just do damage at the top, and you would probably still get the high score in one phaser pretty easily with the blister damage. And if you really were impatient with blisters, you could still cheese her with her claw at the very top floor. I just don't think it's generally something people are going to go out of their way for most of the time. That being said, I'm pretty happy they patched the Joining Allies glitch, and I'm more than thankful that Riven's back and it's like actually decently hard, at least at the start of it. But I just think that it's wasted potential, and if you're not someone that has done the encounter legit, like back in the day, then it's probably much better than to someone like me. And for the last encounter, Nezarek. In my opinion, Nezarec sucks. To most people who know me, that's probably a surprise hearing that from me. On one hand, I think the changes they made in practice are excellent. However, there are ways around said changes, and it just ultimately flopped. I would argue this encounter actually got a lot worse in some ways. This encounter on day one was god awful, so at first I was a little hopeful to see what they would do, especially after ending on such a high note with Rolk. You can't camp on a node, forcing you to either move around or stay put in places that Nez can reach and potentially disrupt your damage. I don't personally have a problem with this, as I thought previously the damage strats for Nez were a snooze fest. But yeah, as you'll probably find out, this change is easily negated the more time went on and people still found spots you could sit on and ultimately ignored this change. The additions of the Colossus on the sides that require buffs I thought were decent, and the boss Colossus that spawns in the middle is also pretty okay, but a lot of this is kind of just ignored because of Nez just being stupid still, and not much of him changing. His AI is absolutely god awful still, and that's 90% of the reason why I hate this fight. I think a lot of the flaws this encounter had before Pantheon release still shows, and I don't necessarily fault Pantheon entirely, but I still think it's pretty bullshit for the most part. The damage check is still completely the same. It's entirely dependent on how Nez behaves, and it's just inconsistent across the board. Sometimes it'll feel like it's a really good damage phase, and other times it feels absolutely terrible. It's not really changed too much in Pantheon. Like, you're still going to be sitting down in one of the cheese spots, and hopefully he won't TP up to you. You're still going to hit the damage check like pretty easily if you're not an idiot. If you're going for the 2-phase, since you're starting at a CP, then it's probably a lot harder. But if you're going for the guaranteed 3-phase, if you did a whole run of Pantheon, it's generally pretty easy to hit it. It's not that difficult. I think if Bungie actually changed to where you couldn't stand anywhere in the arena, and you would actually have to be forced to do DPS to Nez on the move, it would definitely be a lot more fun of a DPS phase, but even then, I still feel like Nez's AI is really bad, and I don't know if the change would be necessarily all good. Doing DPS on the move would be a lot better. While yes, Nezarek's still going to occasionally TP and screw up your damage, it still would be a lot more fun. The more I think about it, it's kind of like Riven in some sense. People don't want to do DPS the way Bungie intended to, so you end up just doing the lazy way, sitting in a single spot and dumping all your ammo on him. I think I would like Nez more if things were more consistent with him across the board. I can't stand him here in Pantheon because he has the same problems and they're amplified even more in -20. The changes, while they had good intent, are ultimately able to be ignored at the cost of a little bit of consistency, and that's my problem. Nothing in this encounter is consistent. I was hoping I'd walk away with the same good experience I had with the other encounters, but with Nez, I'm reminded why I can't stand this fight. So overall, I'm really happy with Pantheon. I think despite some encounters showing the shortcomings of the game mode, it's still a breath of fresh air playing this every week. Hopefully Bungie does take the feedback they receive from the community and bring the game mode back again at some point. It's a really good idea and left a really good impression for a lot of players. That'll be it for me. Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.